Alright guys, so let's talk about Europe today because things are getting extremely desperate. Now the US has been sidelining Europe in almost everything, especially when it comes to the negotiations with Russia. Now Trump has also told Europe basically, you can't count on us for your defense anymore. And if you're the EU, it's economic Armageddon. Since the Second World War ended, you have been heavily dependent on the US for defense. And now the EU is attempting something never done before to rebuild their defense industry and military without depending on the United States. Now, they have signed a lot of security agreements with partner countries to procure weapons, and that includes South Korea. It's a big reason why their defense stocks are going through the roof today. But realize this exercise is going to cost the EU trillions of dollars. It's money that they currently don't have. They have to borrow it through debt while also waging a trade war with the United States. And to make this happen, von der Leyen wants to hit the emergency button to break apart the fiscal rules, to basically dig Europe into a debt trap to fund rebuilding.
And this is why we will propose to activate the national escape clause of the Stability and Growth Pact. This will allow member states to significantly increase their defense expenditures without triggering the excessive deficit procedure. So if member states would increase their defense spending by 1.5% of GDP on average, this could create fiscal space of close to 650 billion euros over a period of 4 years. The second proposal will be a new instrument. It will provide 150 billion euros of loans to member states for defense investment.
But the EU faces a very big problem. This is not a unified bloc. Many member states are not happy with von der Leyen's plan. Italy and Spain, for example, they don't want the additional debt burden. Their economies are already being crushed by Trump's tariffs. And the EU is going to get more enormous pushback in the months to come. Germany, for example, they want to raise €1 trillion to rearm the country. But it would be over 12 years. It's simply not enough money. And as we said before, defense spending in the EU will be very wasteful because the energy crisis isn't solved yet. Goldman just need the numbers and they agree. Every €100 spent will boost GDP by only €50. So Germany's trillion euro plan will only yield around 500 billion in real output. Europe has to find a way to raise more money beyond just that. If you think they need 5 trillion euros, they probably need 10 trillion. And that's why the EU is ready to do the unthinkable. The European Commission has outlined a really crazy plan to use the money of people living in Europe. The Commission has revealed a plan to use 10 trillion euros of their citizens' savings, and that's 10 trillion being channeled into what they call strategic investments. Now, I don't know about you, but this sounds extremely disturbing, especially when we dig into the mechanics of this. Now, this will be done through the Savings and Investment Union, whose mission is to create a single market for EU financing. And in this case, it's going to fund all the defense projects. Europeans are some of the best savers in the world. Europe is struggling to meet its investment needs. The SIU will help Europeans get a better return on their hard-earned savings while bringing substantial investments into the economy, and that's their manifesto. Now, to be sure, this isn't a compulsory program. It's most probably going to be voluntary for those who want to get a better return, but there are definitely risks. It's important to remember these are not government bonds like the German bonds being offered backed by the government. And here's my issue with it. Will the EU citizens know where and how the money will be invested? Will there be liquidity issues if someone wants to withdraw their savings in a hurry in all these strategic investments? Now, the EU has announced a list of 47 strategic metals projects to embark on. They say it's to cut China dependence, but it's really just to build back their fractured supply chains. And if you want to build back your military and manufacture weapons, you better have the raw materials ready because if you don't, your costs will simply fly through the roof. Now, this is the list of strategic projects for Europe. They are moving to secure minerals that include aluminum, boron, cobalt, rare earths, and tungsten, all needed for the military, EVs, and semiconductors. And the goals are equally ambitious. They want to meet 10% of annual EU demand through domestic extraction, basically digging the minerals out. They also want to process 40% of the minerals. Now, this is very unlikely because the EU is starting from scratch, and to accomplish this by 2030, it's crazy. When you consider how many regulations they already have, it's one big bureaucratic nightmare. The EU is basically behind the eight ball for at least 3 decades. They're heavily dependent on critical minerals from Chinese suppliers, and this puts them in a very weak position. In 2024, the EU depends on China for nearly 100% of rare earths, nearly 100% of magnesium, which is a military and aerospace mineral. Going down the list, China is supplying them with almost every single mineral that they need, which poses a very big problem if Europe decides to build out their own supply chain while being antagonistic towards Beijing. If China weaponizes all their resources against the EU, they could halt many of their projects. Beijing could ramp up supply and flood the economy with critical minerals, and that could turn many projects economically unfeasible. Conversely, they can always restrict minerals and drive up the cost of production, or do a combination of both. And if the EU decides to use the savings of citizens, these investments are most probably not guaranteed or not secured. If the project collapses, this could lead to one of two disastrous consequences. Either people will lose their money, they'll lose their investments, or the Eurozone will be forced to do a bailout, and that will literally destroy their bond markets or crash the euro, and either scenario would be horrific. Either people will lose their money or the EU will be forced to do the unthinkable. They'll have to do a bailout, and that would literally destroy their bond markets or crash the euro. And either scenario would be horrific. Europe, however, is in desperation mode. They have to find the money to fund their big rearming adventure because $1 trillion, 1 trillion euros is clearly not enough. Bond yields in Germany has been flying up and staying up. We have gone from negative to 2.5% today. Money managers are all expecting the 10-year German yield to hit 4% or more by 2028 in just 3 years' time. And this will most definitely sow the seeds of a big debt crisis for Germany down the road. And unless they plan to only export missiles and battle tanks, the money put in won't revive their economy. And let's not forget, for every €1 you put in, you only get like 50 cents of GDP growth. So this is one road you can't walk on forever. Sooner or later, things will come to an end. It would most definitely be a struggle for the EU, especially after Trump's auto tariff on the bloc. A lot of EU economies, especially Germany, they're hanging on to dear life to export cars to the US. Just last year, the Germans exported nearly $25 billion worth of cars to the United States. The US is the top destination, and the second biggest buyer of German cars is China. They're getting squeezed from both sides. Chinese competition like BYD is smashing Volkswagen into the ground. Exporting to the US from China is impossible, and shipping cars to Trump's economy will cost more. Companies like Porsche and Mercedes could suffer a $3.7 billion hit as well. Normally, it's the US consumer who bears the bulk of tariff increases, but for German brands, things might be a little different. There's a chance they might have to eat a substantial amount of the tariffs, and here's why they might have no choice at all. By imposing the auto tariffs, Trump has leveled the playing field for domestic US companies like Tesla and Ford. In fact, Tesla makes all their cars sold in the US within the country itself, which means in order to retain pricing power and compete with domestic US brands, Volkswagen, for example, they might need to eat some of the increase. Might not be 25%, but they will have to share the pain with the consumer. And this puts the German economy in a dire situation, especially when they want to raise $1 trillion for their war machine. Now, if we look at German automakers in the US, we can see something really interesting. Around half of their US production is sold within the country. 51% are exported out, which means manufacturing in the US is somehow still cheaper than Germany. German companies might be forced to really leave Germany and relocate to the US, so more plants in Indiana and less in Emden or Wolfsburg, which will just deindustrialize Germany even further. So it's a complete tragedy. By not solving their energy crisis first, the Germans are going to face a further industrial collapse of their automakers while trying to raise a boatload of debt for war spending. And in a really bizarre twist, Trump warned US automakers not to raise prices in response to the tariffs. And if they do, companies will get punished. And that means importers are going to eat the tariff. As a German company, you are now faced with the unthinkable. Either produce cars in the US or potentially absorb the entire 25% tax yourself in order to compete. But can the Germans afford to lose more industries? The more this happens, the more expertise and labor will leave the country. Supply chains and infrastructure will be more fractured than ever before, and this will make it even harder to build up their defense base. Essentially, the black hole gets even bigger, and so will the debt bill. And as we speak, the US is going to make it even harder for Europe to survive. Remember the Ukraine mineral deal? Well, Trump just did a Darth Vader. He's altering the deal, and Europe better pray he doesn't alter it any further. The US is moving to control the entire resource base of Ukraine, and that will be squeezing Europe out. The revenue and profits will be under US control. The details are actually quite horrific, to be honest. It looks like a deal from hell.
So we've now presented the Ukrainians with the full, nearly 100-page document that will be the binding agreement for this deal. We have a technical call tomorrow. Well, it's always been part of Trump's global strategy, and as we talked about when we were going into Kyiv and when we were in Kyiv, the original idea, and I think we can put that back on track, was to show no daylight between the United States and the Ukrainians. So by signing this deal, Ukrainians will close that daylight. The U.S. will have an economic interest in the success of the country. The American people will know that there is payback for all the resources we put in. And if the Ukrainians succeed, we succeed. So it really ties us together. It is not a security guarantee, but it is an economic security pact.
Once again, words have meaning. Besson said that it is not a security guarantee. This is an economic security pact, which, to be honest, is really very, very blurry. The plan is also part of Trump's global strategy, likely referring to the hunt for global resources. And looking at the details of the deal, the US will make out like a bandit. They will control all major future infrastructure and mineral investments in Ukraine. The US is also demanding the right of first offer ahead of the EU. Europe is effectively out, they are pushed away. The US would control investments into Ukraine across all infrastructures, across all industries, especially when it comes to ports, mines, oil and gas, and the extraction of critical minerals. It's clear as day what the US is gearing up for. They are shifting their focus from Europe all the way to the Pacific to contain China. And to do that, they will need to secure their supply chains right under Europe's noses. And because the EU doesn't have a credible military, they are helpless to do anything. Ironically, this securing of Ukraine's minerals is going to make it even harder for them to militarize. The defense bill is going to soar to the moon. But let me know what you think. Will Europe really use their people's savings? And will the US basically snatch away everything? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.